the Harpst Center for Catholic Thought and Culture. And we're delighted to be featuring this wonderful young scholar here this afternoon. Just a few instructions for today. For the best coverage, you probably want to put your view on speaker view, although there will be a PowerPoint presentation during the talk. The talk will go for about 40 minutes. Then after the talk, we'll have a period of question and answers. We'd ask that you type your questions into the chat feature on the screen. And then we will call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly to Maureen. During the presentation, everyone will be on mute. And we'd ask that you might want to turn your video off as well, because it makes the presentation clearer sometimes. So welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce a noted scholar, Michelle Dillon, who is going to introduce Maureen. Michelle Dillon is a sociology professor at the University of New Hampshire and has her recent work, Post-Secular Catholicism, Relevance and Renewal, and a very important study, Catholic Identity, Balancing Reason, Faith, and Power. So we welcome Michelle. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you all. It's great to see so many here. It's really my honor to be introducing Professor Dr. Maureen Day. I think one of the great disappointments of all of the COVID disruptions has been that we can't celebrate our scholars in person. I think it's always exciting when you have your book just published to be able to go to a conference and have an authors critics panel, because even though sometimes there can be complicated and difficult questions, it's also a celebration of the scholar and the work. And for young scholars like Maureen, I think it's fantastic that we can meet here this afternoon or this evening, afternoon in San Diego, East Coast, we're 5 o'clock here. Maureen is one of these rare scholars that is so well able and so deftly does it to merge her sociological background and sociological immersion with her keen theological understanding and education. And you know, she's a professor, of course, assistant professor of religion and society. That's such a great title, because I would think that all social sciences, scientists at least, want to be professors of religion and society. Maureen is that and brings to that a real deep, smooth integration of those two disciplines of the social sciences with the theology, and just manages to write in such a beautiful and accessible way. Of course, her new book, Catholic Activism Today, is certainly groundbreaking, but she is already such a highly published scholar. She has written research reports. She has edited a very important book on young American Catholics. She has worked with Tricia Bruce, who I see is also here today, on that very interesting report from Notre Dame that came out recently on understanding American abortion attitudes. Her PhD is from the Graduate Theological Union, that wonderful place in Berkeley, California. And she's currently, of course, an assistant professor at the excellent Franciscan School of Theology in San Diego. I do think Maureen obviously is going to talk about her work for the next several minutes, and I'm hoping that she will address how it is that she is so well able to get so immersed in the ethnographic and the personal details of individuals, and yet at the same time so beautifully understand the complex social and historical period in which they live, and that these are such coalescing forces in driving Catholicism and in driving belief and activism. So I really, if I had a hat on, I'd take it off to Maureen, or I'd raise a glass, which of course we don't have any in my office. Unfortunately, as Dean, I have to model good behavior. But this is a wonderful opportunity. Great to see so many scholars able to join the call. So that's the upside of COVID, is we can Zoom. And this is just such a wonderful piece of scholarship, and it's impactful not only for scholars, but of course for all kinds of people, including people who care about the state of religion and of religious education and of religious motivations in our civic discourse and in our political activity. So thank you, Maureen, for doing this, and please go ahead. So thank you for the opportunity.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. Michelle, before we got started on this, she said, don't make this about me, Maureen. And I just do want to say, though, very briefly, thank you so much for that very warm introduction for this. When I started my graduate school program, my very first semester, I read Catholic Identity, and I read it 2 more times before I finished just my thesis alone. Kept going back to it. And so it just it blows me away that you are introducing me today. So just thank you so much for being here and your support. So thanks everyone for coming today, because this is fantastic for you. This is the quarantine book launch is a new model that we're getting used to. So I wish that I could be sharing craft brew and swanky appetizers with you all today. But instead we are just the people who care most about the topic are here. So yay, this is the guest thinner, as we should say. So thanks so much for coming here and caring about the topic. And I'm just very excited to get into this with you today. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen here now. And here we go. So this should be, hopefully we can all see this. Understanding Catholic, so this is the book cover. Understanding Catholic Discipleship and Citizenship in the Contemporary United States. This is what I hope that my book does for its readers. And some of you, I know you've already given me a heads up that you've already read it. Some of you, this is a brand new topic and book. So I'm excited to walk you through pieces of it in a few minutes. So just to give you a quick overview of the methods, how did I come to study, how did I come to the findings that I did? So first of all, I should tell you a little bit about Just Faith Ministries, because Just Faith Ministries was the focus of the topic overall. And so who they are is an organization. It started out, Just Faith started before there was Just Faith Ministries. It was just a parish program. Just one of the parish staff decided to say, you know, how can we take kind of the dynamism and energy of RCIA and translate it into something that can teach people about faith and justice. And so then suddenly the program that he created was called Just Faith. And then in the early 2000s, Just Faith Ministries was born. It's based in Louisville, Kentucky. And what they do is they create curricula for churches to run small group programs for people between 8 to 12 is what the ideal is for many of their programs. And to learn more about peace and justice issues from a perspective of faith. And so what I did is I interviewed 61 people, 27 were in the Louisville area, which is again where they are. 25 are in the San Francisco area and 9 are in the Los Angeles area. And then I also asked all of the people I interviewed to fill out surveys, and I got 88% of those back. And then I had another group, a few other groups also to fill out some surveys, but I'll get into that in a moment. But primarily we're looking at the surveys from the people I interviewed. And then I also did 270 hours or more of hours of participant observation. So I went to, primarily that was going to Just Faith groups themselves. So I've been through 4 of the different programs, but I was also on Just Faith sponsored retreats. There were a few activities and events that I went to as well. And that's where a lot of the ethnography comes from in the book. And so what I decided to do is, rather than tell you what kind of I was writing, I wanted to touch on what my readers were reading. And so 3 people really graciously offered back cover blurbs for this. 2 of them are here today. So Dr. Tricia Bruce is here for us. And one of the things that she said in her blurb is that the book masterfully captures the contemporary relocation of Catholic, let's see, I can't quite see my whole screen, of Catholic activism, maybe from institution building to personal transformation. All right, so what does that look like? So previously, and I draw a lot on the work of historian David O'Brien for this first chapter. Historically, Catholic activism was characterized by the Republican style, is what he calls it in the beginning. And this was primarily English Catholics from the country of England who migrated to the United States, taking what he calls a Republican style, which really kind of bifurcated your private life was characterized by Catholicism, but were you in the public sphere, you were definitely an American citizen, and those 2 worlds didn't cross. And then with the immigration of poorer Catholics, especially from Ireland and Germany, we had what he calls the immigrant style. And then that's when public Catholicism changed. We saw the vast numbers of Catholics migrating from Europe who were seeking, who didn't have the higher level of education that previous Catholics did, lower socioeconomic status, and were also confronted by a new kind and more aggressive kind of anti-Catholicism. And then we have the evangelical style that came about in the early 1900s to about 1960. And this is when Catholicism was characterized more by social reform than the previous styles were. And then David O'Brien ends his analysis there. And this is where my analysis sort of picks up. So what I argue is that from 1960 to the present day, we see a new sort of public Catholicism, but it's really different from from the previous styles, and I'll get into that in a second. But what the kind of social roots that gave rise to that is an increase in geographic mobility. So Catholics are moving around the country more and more than they were previously. And this gives rise to different sorts, and this is not just with Catholics, but as people move more, they tend not to do institution building. They tend not to engage in community projects, and they tend to do more volunteering as individuals because it's easy to enter and exit into a volunteer opportunity. Another characteristic was we see an increase in the individual locus of moral authority, which just means people are looking more and more to themselves and their own personal conscience for making decisions than they are to external authorities. And then we also see increasing socioeconomic status. So Catholics, especially with the GI Bill after World War II, we see Catholics steadily rising up the socioeconomic ladder in the country, and then an increasing in professionalism as well. And so so what I would say the four kind of hallmarks of the discipleship style are, and these are all kind of expressions of personalism, which, you know, I distinguish it from individualism in that it's not self-centered, it's both individual as well as community oriented. But these four characteristics are that we're looking at individual engagement rather than block engagement. So Catholics of a historical style engaged in relief societies and in parish organizations or, you know, hospitals, that sort of institution. But now we're seeing Catholics really engage society as individuals, and often not in concert with Catholic organizations or Catholic sponsored organizations. Then we also see people are implementing individual level solutions rather than structural solutions. And so their focus of the caring is more of the mercy variety, the one-on-one, than it is of the social reform or of other institution sort of building that we saw in the past. And then the third one is a growing sense of an internal locus of moral authority. So not only is it one of the forces that gives rise to it, but it's also something that is built upon, capitalized upon by the discipleship style organizations themselves. So that you'll see that conscious formation becomes a much larger part of this. Also, like individual and personal discernment becomes a larger piece of that. And then finally, seeking personal and religious meaning in volunteer commitments and beyond. So before, the previous styles tended to separate the activism or the civic engagement from the faith. And for discipleship style Catholics, they're really looking to integrate those two. Mainly because Catholic institutions are much weakly tethered to adherence than they were previously. And so it was really easy when you had your child that you would drop off at Catholic school, you would come home from work from your Catholic hospital, you'd drop off your clothes at St. Vincent de Paul. You really felt like everything you were doing was enmeshed in this Catholic world and had Catholic significance to it. Now that we're more weakly tethered to our institutions, people need to make intentional shifts in their imagination to see the religious significance of what they're doing. All right, and so another one of the scholars, Dr. Jerome Baggett, writes, flowing from her analysis of this discipleship style organization comes ever-widening insights regarding contemporary American Catholicism, strategies and dilemmas associated with grassroots activism, and undulating still further, the prospects of living meaningful, generative lives at a time when possibilities for doing so seem to be constricting. So I'm going to focus here on what this contemporary American Catholicism looks like insofar as the way that it manifests in the contemporary sphere of public life. And so there were 5 core values, and I have a quick story to share with you about this. I had done a lot of my interviews, so I had done probably half of my interviews so far. I had done 2 years of ethnographic work, and I still was not seeing the dissertation cohere in the way that I really thought it needed to solidify. And I was just like, wow, I don't know what to do. So I'm walking around the Louisville office, and suddenly I see this posted on a little 8x10 on someone's cubicle. And it was the core values of Just Faith Ministries. And it had these 5 listed: transformation, Christ-centeredness, community, outreach. Theirs was justice. I'll get into the difference there in a second. And compassion. And I suddenly realized that everything I'd seen so far, everything that I had read about, all of the interviews, touched, like probably 98% of it touched on one of these 5 themes. And I was just like, wow, I'm like, well, I had some resistance, some inner resistance. I'm not going to let this core values list dictate how I'm going to write my book. But then as I took a few weeks away from that, I started seeing not just the way Just Faith Ministries is animated by these core values, but L'Arche, but San Egidio, Opus Dei, like Jesuit Volunteer Corps. I suddenly started seeing the ways that Catholic civic life overall was animated by these things. And I realized that this was provided a great window into looking at Catholic public life more broadly. So to look at these 5 in just a bit more depth, so transformation, which is something we'll come back to in a bit, but just to give you in their own words what some of my interviewees said. So a Just Faith staff member who I interviewed said regarding transformation, sometimes you got to wake people, and if you can't wake them, you got to shake them. How many people want to be asked to uproot themselves? But that is fundamental to our story. Abraham did it. Moses did it. Jesus did it. You know, uproot yourself and go into the desert and find a new way of living. So transformation, having that internal change that causes external practices to change as well, is part of, which eventually ripples out into social change, is part of the Just Faith process. And compassion as well. We never, this is a Louisville grad talking about growing up in rural Kentucky. We never locked our doors at night. If we needed to borrow something from a neighbor, we just go help ourselves and put it back. And then he talks about how after Just Faith, his notion of compassion changed. It went from being just altruism into something that would include political activity for marginalized groups. And so then he goes on to say, well, I think compassion is the very essence of those who accept Just Faith teachings, gospel teachings. We have, sorry, I can't see the tail end of my slide. Let me see if I can, I'm just gonna put this into a slightly smaller mode so I can read it all. I can, oops, I skipped a slide as well. Sorry about that. Okay. Well, I think compassion is the very essence of those who accept Just Faith teachings, gospel teachings. We have to have empathy and consequently compassion for those on the margins of society. And then moving on to community, the third value. Someone talked about how she had an opportunity and someone said that I should have quit that Just Faith group. I really don't know why, but I made a commitment to the group, so I didn't feel good to leave people. I also felt that there was something in the group that I was getting that was different from any other group that I had experienced. I can sort of do prayerful reading on my own, but there was something about that group. Why I would say to someone, it must be grace. It's a mystery. And so community and the people that they're studying with are a really important feature of the formation aspect for discipleship style Catholics. And you know, this is one she's just talking about how she has this affective connection, but there are some people that I interviewed who talked about much more intense experiences of community. I'd heard, you know, you always catch wind of the groups that had sold their houses and all moved together into one large house. And I didn't interview anyone who had done that personally, but there was someone I interviewed who said that as her group continued to meet, even after their Just Faith program officially ended, when one of their members was at the last 3 months of his life, they all became his primary caregiver. He lived alone, and they made sure that 24 hours a day, one of the people who were in that Just Faith group was there so that he would never be alone in those last few months. So we see that this community is a really enduring and important part of the Just Faith process. And then also outreach is a really important piece as well. So for Just Faith Ministries, they specify that justice is a really important thing. So for them, that is social reform and creating real larger systemic levels social changes. But it could be for a group that it's just about doing acts of mercy, small one-on-one acts of social provision, such as a homeless shelter might provide clothing or a place to sleep or that sort of thing. So for outreach here, we have one person talking about how she was affected in this way. Well, I think starting with a viewpoint that we are responsible for each other. What happens to you happens to me is the basic premise to start with. And then I think that informs the kind of policies we set and so forth. We have limited resources, obviously. We have to recognize that. How we spend those resources, I think, is very much informed by our basic view of the world and humanity. And I think that's very much informed by my faith. So here, and you can see all of these values are sort of bleeding into each other. So she's talking about faith here, and in community, we talked about how faith and transformation was important as well. And then there's also the aspect of Christ-centeredness. So one of the grads that I spoke to said, "The story that helps me stay focused is when Peter walked on the water. You remember, and the storm came up. Jesus said, 'Come on over here.' And Peter gets up out of the boat and walks over to him. And he was walking on the water. But a storm came up, and he got afraid, and he took his eyes off of Jesus, and he wasn't able to walk on the water." And I just keep saying to myself, keep my focus on Jesus. If my focus is on Jesus, I can do anything. And so this idea of being Christ-centered is also really important when we start to look at Catholic organizations more broadly. Previously, Catholic organizations of the past were very Catholic in their style. They're a lot more ecumenical now. So for example, even groups that we would consider to be more conservative, like Opus Dei, open their membership to both non-Catholic Christians and non-Christians. And we can see a shift also as well from church teaching to gospel teaching and the teachings of Christ. So there's this shift that we see now on Christ-centeredness that characterizes groups of today. And so then my final piece is Dr. Michelle Dillon, whom you got to hear from earlier. Part of her blurb says, "Using thoughtful interview and observation data, her gentle yet rigorous narrative persuades us that individuals' everyday decisions and actions have a ripple effect in the crafting of a better, more morally authoritative society." And so I wanted to touch on that piece of the ripple group here, the ripple effect on the crafting of a more better society. And so part of what that alludes to is what I call the ripple group. So part of the strategies of Catholic groups today is that they gather their members into these small, intimate communities, and there's where a lot of formation takes place. And so the ripple group refers to a transformation about the individual's beliefs, which then should ripple out into the way they act in the world. And then the great ideal is that then that person's actions will affect the people around them, eventually rippling out into society. And so starting with that interior level of transformation, the grads had 5, and so I'm focusing on one chapter here. Each of those 5 core values has its own chapter. And so I'm gonna just kind of walk you through the transformation chapter here. So each of the grads talked about religion centering transformation. That was common across all grads. And so what that means is that religion went from being a part of their life to the central part of their life, and that they wanted their religious beliefs to inform all of the other pieces of their life, from their work to their leisure to how they just donated and spent their money, all of those things. Political transformation happened in a couple of ways. It either meant that poverty and related issues went from being more peripheral in their political values to more central, or it meant that they simply had a much broader understanding of the ways that poverty was connected to other issues. The religio-political transformation was something that a lot of the grads experienced as well, which just simply meant that they might have had their religion and their politics more separated previously. And then through Just Faith, they understood that, oh, the death penalty has actually religious implications as well. And so they got to see the ways that their political values that they already held actually held religious significance as well. And they also described intensification. So they just suddenly had a lot stronger values in what they had previous. They had the same values, but they were much stronger than they were previously. And then another group of grads, and many of these groups overlap. It wasn't that you experienced one of these or the other. But then motivational transformation. So it went from like, yeah, I've had all these beliefs, but they never were strong enough that I would actually act on them. And now I see myself acting on them. So those were sort of the interior transformations that they just described. So shifting to the exterior ones, and we can just look at the Catholic, just because of the focus of there were a sizable number of Protestants in the study as well, but we'll focus on the Catholic volunteers. So we see that what I did is I surveyed, I did not interview, but I surveyed pre-Just Faith Catholics. So these were Catholics who had just started the Just Faith program, but they hadn't gone through it yet. So they were in one of the first 3 sessions out of a total of, they were 27 sessions at that time. And so what they did is, as I could compare their data to the responses of the people that I interviewed who had been through and completed Just Faith, and then thanks to other surveys that surveyed Catholics nationally, I could compare both of those groups to Catholics nationally. So for example, when you look at this one, you can see that American Catholics more broadly, just looking at the first row and the final column, 12% of American Catholics volunteer outside of church monthly or more. Among people just starting Just Faith, the first column, half of them donate at that rate, or sorry, they volunteer at that rate. But 80% of Catholics who've been through the program volunteer monthly or more. So we see that there is a selection bias of people who go into Just Faith, but there is this transformation that happens as a result that increases that as well. And then just to put that into perspective, what does that mean? So, and we especially see larger transformational shifts when we look at justice activities more specifically. So one of the things I discovered was 16% of Americans, and this is national data, have been involved in a political party or organization in the last year, and only 2% have been involved in the last month, compared to 25% of the people who've been grads who've been through the program who are involved in justice on a monthly basis. So what does that look like in maybe graphs? So if we took 100 people who had been through Just Faith Ministries, a fourth of them would be involved in a justice activity monthly or more. If we took 100 random Americans from the population, we see 2% of those folks would be involved in a justice activity monthly or more. And by the end of the year, that means that those 25 people would have been involved in 300 acts of justice, whereas those 2 people would have been involved in 24 acts of justice. So this is what it translates to on a larger scale. And then I was also able to access for 4 different congregations. 3 of them were Catholic, 1 was Protestant. The bulletins, so I could compare the transformation at the parish or the congregational level for each of these groups. So what I did is I looked at the bulletins for 1 year before any Just Faith programs started, and I was able to count and categorize each of these groups, and then look at each of these ministry offerings. And then I could do the same thing after 3 sessions of Just Faith. So I could see, how does running 3 sessions of Just Faith change the ministry offerings of a congregation? And so what I found out was, without going into depth on all of these, but we see a really huge increase in justice actions. So it doubles, it more than doubles for justice actions. We see a big increase for prayer for justice and peace. Also a substantial increase in education on some sort of social issue, for example, homelessness rates in the community, and then also charity actions as well. So we see those sorts of changes happening. And so that was what some of the transformation findings that were in that chapter. But I also wanted to not miss the fact that we are talking about not just findings today, but like a larger story. So what does this book not just contribute on the level of findings, but what sort of larger themes can we tease out of the book? And that's kind of hinted at in 2 of the blurbs as well. So for example, the prospects of living meaningful, generative lives at a time when possibilities for doing so seem to be constricting, as well as the crafting of a better, more morally authoritative society. So how does this book pull and add to that story and contribute to that story? So one of those things is awakening. So unlike choosing a particular quote that really helps us demonstrate a finding, choosing a quote that lifts up a broader narrative theme is a little trickier, but I'm going to try it anyway. So this book tells a story about awakening. So when I gave surveys to people and I said, here's my self-addressed stamped envelope, complete this at your leisure and send it back to me. One of these was delayed quite a bit, and then it finally came, and it came along with a letter. And within this letter, the person, you could tell, was really doing some reflecting, that our interview had caused her and her husband, I interviewed them together, to think a little more deeply about this. And the wife this is an excerpt of that letter that the wife had sent. She said, I wish I could tell you that my husband and I worked with Mother Teresa's sisters in Calcutta or in a leper colony in India, but our steps were definitely baby steps, including donating to a priest who works in a leper colony in India. Still, we are painfully aware of the difference between sending a check and holding the hand of a sick leper. But we have tried to support the missionaries by hosting them often in our home. We have tried to make small but positive changes. We have been much more conscious of our effect on the planet's limited resources. We have volunteered at clothing drives, food drives, shoe drives, and Habitat for Humanity. I have taken our grandchildren to deliver food packages in poor neighborhoods, and as a family, we have eliminated gift exchanges at Christmas and donated the money to various charities. So now what comes through in this letter is awakening. It's a heightened awareness. It's an experience of disquiet. It's an increase in concern. And honestly, it's a lot of self-doubt when she compares her personal efforts to the world's needs. But even though she's obviously unsettled, what makes her sentiments an occasion of awakening for her is that she's even bothering to ask herself, am I doing enough? What more could I be doing? This sentiment also happened for other interviewees in the plural form. Are we doing enough? What more could we do? So for the interviewees, part of this story of shared human life is that no individual has to answer every question. Really, just asking the question is good enough, and then together we can think through the answers. So this is a story of individuals who realize that their most authentic self is deeply embedded in their communal context, that we discover our individuality through a life intimately shared with others. So this awakening is a story of awareness, it's a story of self, it's a story of recognizing the possibilities for growth, and really a story about people who are looking at their world in a new way. And I have another kind of theme. So this is also a story about meaning making. As scholars from a variety of disciplines have noted within their respective disciplines, humans are meaning making animals. This interviewee here kind of piggybacks on the previous one, is discussing the vast needs of the world and how recognizing these needs rather than overwhelming her gives her hope and purpose. But there is a sense that there is never enough, that there is always more. And that can seem like getting to the summit of Everest, or it can seem like having purpose and always having drive and always being able to do a little bit more. Not the sense of living in a dissatisfied state, but living in a hopeful state, that until there is no one on the earth who knows hunger, until all suffering is eradicated, then there is more for us to do. So by really entering into our world, by being involved, by creating community, we can construct lives that are saturated with purpose, with hope, and truly realize a joy-filled reason to get up in the morning, no matter how challenging that day might be. And then finally, human.
Let's hang on for just a moment. We're experiencing a technical difficulty in this age of Zoom. We're used to this, so don't panic. We know what to do. Maureen should be back shortly.
I'm sorry about that, everyone. I'm back.
There we go. Great.
So sorry. Yeah, that doesn't normally happen in your live's book launch, but thanks for sticking around.
It's something to remember it by.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And speaking of humanness and all of the different things that we might encounter, I'll leave off, I'll pick up where I left off. So yeah, we exist at the same point of history together, that my heart should be breaking because people are homeless, because people are suffering, because people are hungry, because people are dying, because people are, sorry, people are alone. And I have this shift in desire from wanting to fix something, wanting to build houses and cure a problem, to this deep personal connection that has opened in me a limitless well of care, and moving from that desire of fixing things, to this one, which makes me sadder and more heartbroken and more devastated and more connected with people. So this is a story about people who know that human life, when we really enter into it, has moments of pain, and that a meaningful life is about entering into another person's pain and caring enough about it to make it your own. This makes social change less about fixing problems and more about building a better society that truly believes that everyone matters, that everyone belongs, that your good and my good are intertwined, and that we're in it together. These participants believe that a fully human life isn't about minimizing our own suffering, but about maximizing love. And that maximizing love actually will lead us into greater suffering. And so their lesson is that life is a gift, and that it is a gift, that gift is about being vulnerable, that gift is about being courageous, believing more is possible, creating relationships. And so even while socially committed religious Americans haven't solved the world's problems, they help point a way toward a more just and more cooperative tomorrow. And so that's where I'll conclude. And thank you again so much for bearing with me in all of this and being with me today. And if you want to contact me by email or see my work or get a discount code, you can get that right there. So thanks.
Yes, everybody make sure you get the discount code, because this book is an excellent Christmas gift. So keep that on your agendas. Okay, so we are going to go into our question and answer period. I'd ask that if you have a question, please type it into the chat function. Then I'll call on you and have you unmute yourself, and you can ask your question for Maureen. So I would like to start by just bringing up the pre-Vatican II period, which your jumping off point. During that era, the whole concept of the mystical body of Christ was pretty central to activism. How does that play in, or would you compare it with what you call Christ-centeredness?
Right. I would say it plays out a little bit in both the Christ-centeredness as well, but maybe more so in the community piece. That it is about the affective relationships, the intimacy, as well as the challenge and personal growth that the small groups offer one another. But I think it comes out in another way as well, because the Just Faith groups don't say, so this is the way to help the poor, this is the way to change racism. It's about introducing people to these topics and then having them discern, again, through personalism, what their role is. And so that's another part of the body of Christ, is we're all going to do different things, but we see ourselves as connected and cooperating in a shared endeavor. That would be where it comes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
When the Just Faith groups you participated in, what was the focus of the Just Faith group? Were they generic social justice, or did they have a particular issue?
Sure. Yeah. So I did 4. I did the general one that looks at 2 to 3 weeks on a variety of topics, from racism to climate change. Poverty is woven throughout the whole thing. Then I also did the engaging spirituality, which is more contemplative prayer. But it focuses that on the external world. I also did Good News People, which requires 100 people. You do, I think, or maybe it's 200. It's been a while. But it's a collection of small groups that a whole parish tries to organize. And then I also, but the one that was focused was the prison ministry one, or prison reform. So it looked at the way that death penalty, the way that prisoners are treated, what sort of social structure, what sort of alternatives are there to the way that we do prison in the United States, compared, like looking at other countries. But yeah, so those were that's the scope of what I looked at or participated in.
Okay. So if anybody would like to ask a question, if you can either raise your hand, or Michelle, did you want to? No. Okay. Okay, is there anything in particular you would want people to take away from this book, Maureen?
Yes. Yeah, there's lots of things. I would say that there is aside from the three things that I brought up towards the end, that there's just that none of the Catholic groups today are, have it perfect, but they're doing I think going back to the body of Christ, they're doing everything very well, and they're kind of paving the way. And so I think that looking at the way, the way that Just Faith Ministries helps us see ways that we can better integrate faith and justice in an American context is a really great model, and we can learn from it and apply it in different ways, whether we're parishes or dioceses, or maybe perhaps a parachurch institution like Catholic Charities, something like that.
Okay, thank you. So we'd have a question from Adolfo Mercado. Are you there, Adolfo? Unmute yourself if you're there. Christine, have we got everybody unmuted?
Okay. Hi, Maureen. I was just curious to hear a bit about the communities that you your interviewees and the communities that you lived with, and maybe some of the demographics of the people who you interacted with more.
Sorry, I missed that.
What was the demographics of the groups you?
Oh, thank you. Got it. Yes, so they tended to be white. They tended to be 60 and up. They tended to be, I would say a fourth were retired and then a fourth worked part-time. So that was the main demographics, pretty evenly split gender-wise. The groups that I was in was Catholic, but I interviewed, I think of the 61 interviews, I think 9 were Protestant, different denominations of Protestantism.
Thank you. We'll go to the illustrious David O'Brien. David, can you unmute yourself? You're still mute, David, you're muted.
Okay. Hi, I'm sorry. I tried to type it in, but it went privately.
That's all right. That's all right.
Just one comment and then a question. The comment is that we were around when Just Faith started, and I think we probably, you would agree, understood it then in terms of, I wouldn't say institution building, but developing recruits and local leaders for a broad national Catholic social action movement in which lots of groups like Catholic Relief Services and Catholic Charities and CHD and others were participating.
Yes.
So we thought Jack was going to generate all these local leaders for us. So that's just a comment. I think it obviously has developed differently than we expected. The other thing that strikes me from your presentation today is the convergence perhaps between some Catholics, at least, the kind of communities that you have here, and a lot of evangelicals. I'm sure there are just anecdotal evidence. I've encountered evangelical communities that would have many of those characteristics: transformation, Christ-centeredness, outreach, community, and compassion. And that's to say something, I guess, about leaving aside the politics. Catholic evangelical overlap, if not engagement, is taking place, I guess, as an Americanization of previous subcultures, like the many subcultures out of which so many evangelicals have come and the ones we've come from. But does it make any sense?
No, it absolutely does. Yeah, and actually, when I presented my results at different conferences that are not Catholic centered, they're sociology of religion conferences, there'd always be a group or two. They say, we have like a Protestant equivalent to that. We can see that there too. So I don't think that this is. I don't want to be too broad and and say this is also in the American society as a whole. But I do see people coming up to me and identifying that their own Protestant traditions have equivalents. And also, yes, I think that there's a lot of sociology of religion that is not Catholic focused, but look at this, like Sharon Nepstad's work on the Central American peace movements and Jonah House and that sort of thing, and really shows how there's been a lot of overlap among Christian groups, Catholic and Protestant, working together, and the sort of theological cooperation that they can share in those efforts.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd ask Tricia Bruce to state her question. Need you to unmute yourself? Yes, thanks, Tricia.
Can you hear me okay? Great. First of all, congratulations so much, Maureen. Awesome work. And it's just such a pleasure to be here. And I look forward to being together in the same physical room to tell you the same. So 2 questions. One, given that you sort of shift the locus of attention here from the institution back to the person, I actually want to flip it back and say, is there anything about the shift that happens in personal culture that also has an effect then on institutions? And to be more specific, you know, some of the examples that you pulled out, not just from Just Faith, but you drew parallels to L'Arche and others. These are all groups that have struggled with things like abuse. And so is there something perhaps even in the looser tethering of institutional ties that carries and creates change? So that's the first question. Second question just has to do more with process. I know you wrote your dissertation, you made it into a book. That's a lot of work, that's hard work. And I just wonder how that was for you, if you have any sort of personal reflection or change that you went through in doing that transition and the transformation that you had along the way. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that one of the things, to speak back to institution building, one of the first things that comes to my mind is that Catholics, lay Catholics, are becoming, because they have a stronger internal locus of moral authority, are more willing to bring their thoughts. And your work on Voice of the Faithful is an excellent example of this. Just the way that people will bring their critiques to church leaders more readily than they have in the past, and how we can see the way that lay faithful will push back on their institutions, say, but what about this? This is the direction I see you heading. What about this? How are we going to address that? And so I think that Catholics are feeling a lot more empowered to both use the resources of their institution, the theological resources and the tradition, as well as seeing ways that there might be some internal critique that those would offer as well. And then to speak to your second question, I think that, yes, I did have lots of kind of awakening. I talked about that as being a theme. It was awakening for myself as well, to see the ways that these Catholics were navigating really difficult questions that I, as a 30-year-old, hadn't had to navigate yet. Hadn't had a real job at that point, being in graduate school. But yes, seeing the way that they employed the tools of millennia, of a millennial-old tradition, into a really contemporary and revivified context, was really inspiring and helps me see the ways that I can do that for myself. It also gave me a lot more, I wouldn't say I would become somewhat frustrated when I saw that so many Catholics were only working towards works of mercy initially, but seeing the way Just Faith incorporates both acts of mercy and a transformation of society into the program and has those integrated, I think helped me realize the importance of both of those roles in the formation of the common good, of a better society, and kind of dreaming differently. So, yeah.
Thank you. We'll go to Mary Zapp now.
Okay. Hi, Maureen. Wonderful. In the greater LA area, are there lots of Just Faith ministries working now?
Right. So I'm not sure on where they are and how many there are, and those will always change year to year. But I did do my interviews in the Santa Monica region of the LA area. So, and actually that group, I can tell you, we talk about what are the social changes. That group was creating a fair trade store right out just a couple blocks down from their parish. So that was one of the ways that they were trying to create a more just society in their backyard. So yeah, that was, yeah. But
is there a website?
There is, yes, justfaith.org. You can go there and read more about they have especially now, a really timely issue they're looking at. They have 3 different modules on racism. They have ones on climate change. And then, if you can't gather the 8 to 12 people at your church context, that you can probably contact the national office, and they can coordinate you with others in your area. So actually Meg Bowerman is here today, and she might have and she's had her hand up. So I don't know if she has a comment or a question, but.
Okay, Meg, you want to ask your question now?
Sure. Great to see you, and great to see you too, Jeff, and everyone. It's such a pleasure. I'm the volunteer coordinator for Just Faith in the East Bay up here in Oakland, and was one of the interviewees, and just delighted for Maureen, and so glad we miss her, and you're lucky to have her down there. Yes, to answer the question, that the website is the best way, and everything that Maureen just said, let them get you involved with some group. These form by word of mouth, and the facilitators are self-proclaimed facilitators with some training and so on. I just want to make a comment. I was going to say it anyway, but before David mentioned the history of the hopes for Just Faith, I'm a proud former board member, and when I took Just Faith in 04-05, of course, the world was quite different. And it so much since then. The courses at the time were 30 weeks, similar to Ignatian spiritual exercises. And we found over time that people really just could not commit to that amount of time. But I'll also comment just briefly that when I took Just Faith, it was very strongly supported by the diocese and promoted. And even though I get support here, it's not promoted. It is not promoted by the clergy. And indeed, the tragedy of George Floyd's murder propelled over 200 people to start taking this faith and racial equity program. And I'm proud to say that one of the parish priests from the founding parish of Just Faith way back here in 2000 finally attended a session. I can't tell you how long that has taken. It's taken 12 years in my time for a priest to sit in on one session. And when he was able to hear his parishioners talk about what these last 8 weeks had meant, he was profoundly moved. So I think this is what it's going to take, and I'm just so delighted Maureen has been, she took a lot of courses and went to a lot of parishes, and just kudos and congratulations, Maureen.
Thank you. Great, thanks. Yeah, and so I think that what Meg's pointing to is, in sociological language, we talk about gatekeepers, right? And so the Catholic Church being very organizationally clear, sometimes that has been really a real facilitation for Just Faith Ministries, because we've been able to coordinate with like the diocesan people, and they've helped promote that sort of thing. But at other times, that can be a barrier if the priest or whomever the ordained leader is not on board with that, then that becomes difficult, clearly. So it can go either way.
Thank you. Has the relationship with the institutional church been positive for the most part?
I would say so. From my research, yes, I'd say it has. For example, that I told you that about the Good News program, where you need 100 people in the parish to be a part of. There was one diocese, the Diocese of Stockton, under the late Bishop Blair, who every parish in his diocese ran that program. So that was that was obvious. That was a clear support from that program.
Yeah, he's an exception. He mandated it, and it made the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Rosemary Leclerc, do you have a question?
Well, in Phoenix, we can't use Just Faith anymore. Our bishop has said we can't use it in our diocese anymore. But my question is, because of that, so many Catholics are one issue Catholics. And so how do you see opportunities to open people to other issues when there's not programs like Just Faith, but it's still at the same time allow them to focus on their issues?
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think Just Faith does a really good job of connecting poverty to a host of issues, and including the abortion issue. They do talk about it in their books, primarily from the vantage point of like, what are the reasons that people seek out abortions? And some of these are economic, and how are these economic reasons? How can we address this as people of faith? Connecting it to life issues more broadly as well. And then so that is one way that Just Faith has been able to, like, I interviewed people who identified as Republican and still identified as Republican after Just Faith. So they don't try to make it a political issue at all, so much as they try to say, you know, poverty is central to the Gospels. It's been central to our faith for 2,000 years. How have we forgotten that, and how can we recover it? So that tends to be the way they approach that.
Thank you. Is Graham Ryan there? Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Hi, I'm speaking to you from England, the UK.
Yes. What time is it for you there, Graham?
Very interesting to hear the differences between the church as it exists, operates in this country and in your parts of America. What I'm interested in asking you is how influential do you think Pope Francis has been in motivating transformation among the groups and the people you spoke to and interviewed?
Great. So Pope Francis, the papal handoff actually happened during my interviews. So that was a really interesting thing. The people who I interviewed prior to the handoff tended to focus more on the parish, and the parish being a place that they were fed spiritually, whereas the people after Pope Francis, who immediately addressed poverty as an important issue to his papacy, they really talked about him like, you know, he was their new buddy sort of thing. So yeah, there's a real fondness, and Just Faith materials, I still get, I'm on the mailing list and I still get lots of materials, and they continually reference Pope Francis. So this has been, I think, a real, this has been an exciting Pope for Just Faith Ministries, and probably Catholics more broadly who are looking to, because Pope Francis really talks about, like, so how do we walk the walk, and that has that pastoral inclination. I think that just Catholics more broadly are finding him to be a really accessible leader. So.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question.
Right.
Would anybody like to ask? Oh, okay, Tricia. Are you muted still?
Thank you. Someone asked the church's response to Just Faith, and I wonder the church's response or anticipated response to your book, or maybe what you would hope the church's response might look like.
Yeah. Well, I would hope that the Catholic leaders who are involved in outreach of any kind really dive into it, because I think it helps give some insights as to how parishes, for example, or dioceses might reanimate around issues around poverty, around Catholic identity, and just because it's what's salient, I think, for churches is not just the outreach, but a sense of mission. And so we've kind of lost, as institutions, as Catholicism is kind of weakened institutionally, we've lost a way to tether people, having a sense of shared mission, having a sense of shared identity. And Just Faith is a program that does this, similar to the way San Edigio better connects people to their faith, and you know, L'Arche and that sort of thing. Other sociological studies have shown that small groups actually more strongly tether people to their parish, rather than what some people might think is they compete for resources. That's not what happens, and that's not what my research has found. So I think that hopefully, one thing that I do bring up in my research in the book is that bishops would probably respond to this form of Catholicism, would have better luck to really enter in. What are the concerns of the flock? What are the concerns of the people in my diocese? What are the concerns of the people in my parish? And how do I help support them, rather than kind of direct their energy according to my interests and the issues I identify? And what's animating them, and what are they passionate about, and how can I support that? And I think that if bishops were to take, or priests were to take that sort of tact, that they would see a lot of activity and renewed energy in their parishes and dioceses.
Thank you very much, Maureen. Do you have any last comment you would like to make before we say goodbye?
I don't. I thank everyone for coming today. It's been fantastic to see your faces and names, and I just thank you for your support and your curiosities in coming today. So thanks.
So Maureen, could you put the book information up again real quick?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Maureen's a wonderful young scholar and represents all of the exciting things happening at the Franciscan School of Theology at the University of San Diego. So there you have Maureen's email, you have her website, and you have the discount code for her book. So make sure you take all of that down. As I said, this is an excellent Christmas gift, so make sure you purchase several copies.
Thanks, Jess.
For those of you who are interested, on Thursday, the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture is sponsoring a talk by Bishop Mark Seitz, which will be at 12:30. He'll be speaking on racism on the border. So if you're interested in attending, go to our website at sandiego.edu/CCTC, and you can find more information about Bishop Seitz's talk. Thank you all for participating, and good luck in the future. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Maureen. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you so much.